Hi, everyone. We're so excited to be here at the 6th annual Clean Energy Week. This panel is going to be on permitting, which is very timely. A lot of permitting action in the news and hopefully some permitting action in Congress. I've got two terrific panelists to discuss everything there is to know about permitting and how we can make it better. First up, we've got Jim Connaughton, the nationally prominent energy, environment, and technology expert, as both a corporate leader and White House policymaker. Jim is currently the president and CEO of Nautilus Data Technologies. Jim was previously executive vice president and senior policy advisor at Exelon and Constellation, and perhaps most importantly for our discussion today, served as chairman of the White House Council on Environmental Quality from 2001 until 2009 as President George W. Bush's senior advisor on energy, environment, and natural resources, and as director of the White House Office of Environmental Policy. Our second panelist is Katie McGinty. She is vice president and chief sustainability and external relations officer for Johnson Controls, the global leader for smart, healthy, and sustainable buildings technology. Katie was the first woman to serve as chair of the White House Council on Environmental Quality and as deputy assistant to President Clinton from 1993 until 1998. Katie also served as Pennsylvania Secretary of Environmental Protection and as chair of the Pennsylvania Energy Development Authority. So we have two former CEQ chairs who really know this whole permitting thing. And they got together as a bipartisan pair with the Aspen Institute's Energy and Environment Program. And they put together a convening and a report, a building cleaner, faster report. And I thought it was just a terrific convening. And so I'm going to ask them some questions about it. And the first question I have is that it starts with a mission statement. That mission statement goes like this: achieving net zero emissions by 2050 is ecologically essential, technologically feasible, economically achievable, but procedurally impossible. That's a bold statement. You know, this report was from last year. This was before the infrastructure law was passed, before the CHIPS Plus Science bill. It was before the Inflation Reduction Act, which had all the funding for deployment. We've got money for innovation. We've got money for deployment. You know, it would seem like our clean energy future is, right at our fingertips. But then you get, that it strengthens the case for technologically feasible and economically achievable. But then we get to procedurally impossible. Can you guys unpack that a little bit?
Well, Zan, I think I'll jump in first, and it's great to be part of the discussion. Thanks for having me, and it's a thrill to be part of Clean Energy Week and to be teamed up with my buddy Jim again. Jim, great to see you.
Great to see you, Katie.
So yeah, we thought we'd grab a little attention with that bumper sticker of what our report and our effort was about. But I wish it was only a bumper sticker. It has the unfortunate, I think, characteristic of being absolutely true. Because here's what we know. We know that the status quo is not solving climate, and that we have to deliver more environmental protection. We have to deliver it faster. Mother Nature's shaking her fist. We got to get going now. So, we do point out pretty significantly the procedurally impossible piece in terms of the status quo. And I'll start just with one stat. We have PJM, the biggest interconnected grid in the country, so absolutely critical to decarbonization, and having to make a move to just put the brakes on 2,500 projects, 95% of which are renewable energy, that would deliver an amount of renewables almost as big as the entirety of what we have on the grid now, all combined. But instead of accelerating that forward, it's the grid's not ready for it, and our processes are tangling it up So we're just going to say, we can't even look at those 2,500 projects. So for us, the environment needs build it better, build it faster, and decarbonize it now. And that means some red tape needs to get cut.
Jim?
Yes, to that, what I'll add is, the group that met, all of us have long histories in the permitting world. And the two aspects, there's permitting, regulatory permitting, Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, NEPA, those things. And then there's the energy system approvals that Katie mentioned. You're talking about hundreds of thousands of decisions to get to net zero, okay? Hundreds of thousands of decisions by agencies, and by anywhere from 12 to 25 different agencies. Okay, federal, state, and then local per project, right? So you have 12 to 25 per project times, hundreds of thousands of decisions. We're not equipped to do that. And what the group came together and asked the question, well, actually, why? Why do we have all this permitting process? All the projects have to comply 100% with all of our environmental health, safety laws, federal, state, and local. The projects actually in their development are approved by technical consultants, they're approved by lawyers, they're approved by insurance companies, and then the people have to put the money up, have to assure going in that these projects comply 100% with all these laws. So there's already a really expensive process where the project proponents actually have to prove to people who are putting money up and insuring the projects that the projects will comply. So we asked the question the other way around to say, look, we all want to get to net zero. In the end, it's hundreds of thousands of projects times hundreds of thousands of decisions on top of that. Why are we making it hard for ourselves? Can we imagine a system where actually, like many other things, the way we pay our taxes, we self-certify. If we get it wrong, there's a process where we're inspected, we're enforced. If it was civil, if it was a mistake, there's a light penalty. If it was intentional, there's a serious penalty. Under the environmental laws, you go to jail. And we asked ourselves the question, well, wait a minute, could we imagine a situation in which we could actually get projects automatically moving forward with this idea of a self-certification mechanism, and then know that we've got the bureaucracy behind it to ensure that everybody continues to comply. And it's that big, okay? It's that big. Everything being discussed so far has tended to focus on NEPA, which is a procedural statute of environmental review. There's a lot of experts on, listening in on this right now, but we're talking about every approval. Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, Endangered Species Act, Fish and Wildlife, wetlands, zoning. Again, every project's got to know what they're doing. They got to know they comply. Do we really have to wait for 5 to 15 years for the bureaucracy? And I mean that in a good way. I like the bureaucracy, but for the bureaucracy to figure out what the project proponents already know, which is they're going to comply.
I really liked how you separated out the concept of environmental standards from a process for making sure that we're following our environmental standards and meeting the high bar. And I think that it is entirely possible to maintain a high bar of environmental standards and improve a process. It's almost always the case that a process can be improved. And then the question is just how. Is the process that we have in place right now really serving what we want it to serve? Last year at the Bipartisan Policy Center, we put together a task force that we called our Smarter, Cleaner, Faster Infrastructure Task Force. A bipartisan group came together and we came up with 23 specific permitting recommendations. And some of them made it into the infrastructure bill, and some of them you'll see on that one pager from Senator Manchin that might be under consideration soon. But your group took a somewhat different approach. Instead of coming up with a whole bunch of different specific recommendations, you came up with 4 very simple concepts to follow. And I liked the simplicity of it. The recommendations you guys had were some projects would get immediate approvals, some would get accelerated approvals. You focus on accelerated adjudications, and then state and local conformity. So let's talk about that first category now, immediate approvals. What are we talking about, and what kinds of projects, and what does an immediate approval mean?
So Zay, can I pick up on a point you were saying? Because I want to come back to your specific question, but I think it's really imperative if we're going to get people really to come together and make this kind of change happen, to underscore, we're not only not talking about lowering the bar on the environment, we are talking about delivering more environmental protection. If you look at where climate change is going right now, we are not up to the job. That environmental degradation is worse. If I could use an example from my former life as CEQ chair, when we looked at that time, both the Endangered Species Act and the National Environmental Policy Act were policies and legislation that people like to kind of pull their hair out about and think was just a train wreck in terms of the ability to move projects forward, but that if you tried to do anything differently, you reduced environmental protection. So you might remember the famous, infamous spotted owl. When we started to go after that, a rigid, non-creative approach to the Endangered Species Act would have had us move heaven and earth and then desperately in the final days of the spotted owl to see if we could save it and pull it back from the brink of extinction. When you take a more creative, expansive approach, in this case, looking at a whole habitat or ecosystem, then we not only protected the spotted owl, but 1,400 species. And yeah, then we were able to give the landowner 50 years of certainty that if you only do projects in these areas that will have minimal or non-adverse impact, then you can move forward. You can't move forward over these areas. So the landowner gets certainty, the ability to invest, the ability to move forward. And environmental protection is enhanced because 1,400 species are saved instead of one, maybe too late to be able to save. What's the relevance to our work in this report? Well, it's right on point, because one of the key things that we say is that we ought to decide what are the priority projects in our mind. They are those projects that deliver deep decarbonization, number one. Number two, let's prioritize pre-examined, pre-permitted pieces of geography for those projects to be built. What does that mean? Two things. One is that initiatives like the Nature Conservancies, where they have meticulously mapped where we have varieties of species and have already identified thousands of miles of where we could, without adverse impact, build decarbonization infrastructure. And or another point we make in the report, what if it's a brownfield? What if you're building on a previously built, now mothballed former coal plant or an old military base? Let's pre-approve those projects. That's kind of what we have in mind, that the project is meeting an urgent need, deep decarbonization, and that it's to be built in a place where we know it won't have adverse impact and in fact could have positive environmental impact. And as I hand the baton to Jim, I would just say, really pleased to see in Europe as well, that very kind of idea has been brought to the fore in an initiative there that would both set a one-year time frame, but also pre-examine and pre-permit geographies where decarbonization infrastructure could positively and affirmatively be built.
Yeah, let me add.
Jim, do you want to add there and maybe also tack on what accelerated approvals would mean, that second category as well?
Yeah, so what we're trying to do is we're making clear we need legislative approvals, right? With the default being yes. At its core, that's what we're recommending, which is we should have an exception process, right, for things that don't fit. So for example, every solar project should just be yes, okay, unless there's unless there's some reason. So the state and locality should be able to describe, not here, as opposed to the other way around. So we're asking for federal and state legislation to start with the default by technology, certain technology types, and there'll be a debate over that. Is it solar plus wind of a certain type, geothermal? But there's a handful of technologies that must be widely deployed, and can we have the default be yes with an exception process for no? So that's kind of the automatic approvals. Also by geography, Katie mentioned brownfields. They're designated brownfields federal and state level. We know those places really require renewal. We know that with 99.999% certainty, a clean energy project will be a net benefit to that community environmentally. It'll be a net benefit socially from an environmental justice perspective, and it will be a net benefit economically. So can we just agree as a matter of legislation that any designated brownfield automatically, a clean energy project that the brownfield is automatically approved? Okay. Now remember, you build the project, you do something wrong, you'll still be inspected, you'll be audited, you'll be enforced, right? So you're still liable if you do something bad to the environment, but you're not going to. Nobody does anymore that has goodwill. And certainly clean energy project proponents don't want to create a negative harm to the environment. So can we accept that? And so think of other geographies. Senator Cory Booker and Senator Tim Scott created this unanimous piece of opportunity zone legislation. This is where communities, state by states, worked with their governors and said, we want investment in these economically disadvantaged areas. So they already had a process. They already had an environmental justice process, really, saying, let's bring economic vitality to these specific census locations. And they already had a public process that said, bring it here. Okay. And so can we agree that anybody proposing a clean energy project that meets the requirements of large-scale decarbonization, as Katie described, can we agree that a project proponent wanting to go to one of those communities, it's automatically yes? Okay. Now, if you want, you can have an exception process where a community says, no, I don't want that. Okay, so you could add that as a tack on, but the whole point of opportunity zones was to create a self-implementing ability to bring investment into these communities. So let's live up to that. Okay, and then when you talk about exceptions, we did realize if you want to build a new large-scale hydropower plant, like a real one, a real big one, that's going to require some study. Okay, so there's some things where there's not a standard. So in places where you have large, complicated projects, where there may be the absence of standards, there could be an exception for that, in which case you would need accelerated approvals. And by the way, that's where I would recommend focusing the dollars that are in the new legislation, focusing the dollars on the small number of very complicated but really big delivery capabilities. So that could be large-scale hydro, it could be nuclear, right, where there's really stringent standards, but it takes a little bit, you got to do some more study work. But the idea is, can we imagine, just like the project proponents do, that kind of study can be done in a matter of 6 months to a year? And not this idea that we're going to have an average of 2 years or 3 years before any kind of decision is made. Because once you end up in that treadmill, 3 years turns into 5, 5 years turns into 5 more years of litigation, and it's 10 years from now. Okay, and these large-scale projects never get built. And those large-scale projects will, the big ones, will be, 1,000 or 20,000x the small ones in terms of their decarbonization value. So can we imagine a process that says, let's get through this fast rather than slow? So that's this idea of an accelerated adjudication. But again, what's key is for Congress to say, let's come up with the buckets. We already know what they are for immediate, and let's figure out the exceptions for accelerated, and then have a really vigorous debate around that. Our group met for 6 months. We came a long way in 6 months to get to automatic approvals. And if we were able to get to yes among us in 6 months, I think the Congress should be able to get to yes too. They should be equally thoughtful about what's automatic and then what's exceptional for a slightly longer process.
Let me build on that for 1 second if I can, because this automatic might sound like it is wholly new to the environmental arena. And does it mean a wholesale rewriting of environmental laws? And we're using the word automatic, but this is a concept that has been very much ingrained in environmental regulatory legislation and permitting activities. Sometimes goes by different buzzwords, right? In the NEPA context, it might be categorical exclusions. In other contexts, it might be a general permit or a permit by rule. Again, drawing back from my experience at the state level, seeing in these statutes, these kinds of provisions, these opportunities for creativity are there. And I remember we had a situation where we desperately needed to get clean water infrastructure in. We had terrible problems with infiltration and pipes that were basically delivering contamination into waterways. And that was an instance where the environment demands we move more quickly. This statute allowed a general permit or a permit by rule. To Jim's point, this is on a footprint where there already has been development, but we're getting rid of the old infrastructure that's contaminating the environment and as speedily as we can, replacing it with infrastructure that's protective. And so these provisions are there. They get overlooked in environmental law and policy, and the environment suffers because of it.
Right. So you've already touched on adjudication, and we're running somewhat tight on time. I might skip that number 3, and just we can all recognize that post approval, the adjudication process is an extra source of delay. And let's move on just for the moment to the state and local issue. So much of the approval process happens at the state and local level. At BPC, with our task force recommendations, we addressed that with a carrot approach, a program to give grants to states that improve their state and local level permitting. They could use those grants to create, state level permitting councils or other things to be more efficient. But you guys did a completely different approach. I would call a stick approach. Can you explain how you came to that conclusion and how that would work?
Yeah, let me unpack a key piece to this. Since Richard Nixon, every president, okay, and every governor has had a permit streamlining council. Okay, we had them under Bush. Katie had a similar thing in different processes. We just had one under President Obama. Trump, President Trump had this big to do about it, and now President Biden does as well. By the way, wonderful people work and lead these councils, absolutely wonderful, and we've all failed, utterly failed. They do not work, and they will not work. And throwing lots of money at them does not produce the scale of what we need. So I want to underline that quite boldly and dramatically. And so we need to retool that concept to be what Katie and I are talking about. We need to retool it to have those councils sort of managing the automated process of getting these projects out the door, as opposed to trying to have their different efforts harmonized. It just doesn't work at scale. And I'll give you the example of the stimulus bill back in 2009. Tens of billions of dollars, ultimately hundreds of billions of dollars were available for projects, but we all found out, most of them were not, quote, shovel ready. What does that mean? They didn't have their permits. Okay, so only a fraction of the money got out the door. And that's the best the bureaucracy could deliver nationwide. 80% or more permitting is done at the state level. Half of that's through federally delegated programs. If we go through an administrative process to try to reform that, that's at the regulatory level, it will take 4 to 5 years, and followed by 4 to 5 years of litigation over all the permitting rule changes. Okay, so it's 10 years before we get some modest improvement, if it was to be successful, if we go the regulatory path. Which is why this is the time when legislators need to do their jobs. So if the federal government's going to allow for automatic permitting under the federal statutes, then the states have to do automatic permitting under the state statutes. And we took the stick approach, which is, and it's the only way states act. Katie and I have been doing this for a long time, the other people on the panel a long time. If the money gets cut off, it's amazing how quickly people act. So if you want access to the $500+ billion in the IRA for climate, you got to make your state procedural process match the federal one, because we need the carbon abatement. And importantly, this is central to the group. Carbon emissions is a cumulative problem. Every year you wait, the problem compounds. So if I can get a project to start 10 years earlier, that's 10x the carbon benefit, okay, in that period. And so we really got under the skin of this, which is these delays not only cost us, create a carbon penalty, but every year a project is delayed, the cost of the project goes up 20%. So if you have a 5-year delay, the project is now doubled in cost. We could have 2x the carbon abatement if we got those same 2 projects permitted in a year, rather than 1 project in 10 years. Okay, this is how important this is. And so we would also say, I hope there's a clean energy standard one day soon at the federal level. And if there is, if you want to participate in that program, well, you have to have automatic approvals for projects that can get credits under that program. That's what our thinking is. We already have now, this new bill has a whole laundry list of projects that qualify for federal dollars now. We've got legislative agreement on this. I mean, it's amazing. It's wonderful. So can we just say at the federal and state level, all of those projects qualify for automatic permitting unless there's an exception, and then have the permitting councils focus on the exception rather than the rule?
And just again, building on Jim's point, so this might also seem, as much as we thought that it was a needed piece of the equation, it also is not brand new. If you look at the federal transportation dollars, if a state falls short on Clean Air Act commitments, then its federal transportation funding is in jeopardy, if not taken away. So it's a page out of that book. We believe it is incumbent on all of us right now with urgency to step up and enable decarbonization to happen. This is similar in terms of a state decides to not do that, then these pots of money that have as one of their major objectives clean energy infrastructure effectively getting built, if that's being frustrated, then those dollars should be at risk in that particular jurisdiction, because we got to move. The clock is ticking, and ticking altogether too loudly.
Yeah, one other note on that, the funding right now, there's something like 350 million for the permitting council. All right, that's 7 million per state over the next 5 to 10 years. Okay, maybe that buys you 10 new employees. Okay, but there's more than, there's a dozen or more permitting processes per project. Okay, so I just want you to appreciate just how small that dollar number actually is when you put it at the ground level to try to improve anything. So it's very well intentioned, but it's ultimately utterly useless in my view. We should put those dollars toward this exception process we're talking about and create a really, we need to exponentially leap forward here. And why wouldn't we? They're clean energy projects, for heaven's sakes. It's exactly what we wanted. We've all wanted since we're kids. Who doesn't want clean energy? So why delay?
So final question, I think it's clear that the narrative around permitting reform has significantly changed over time. I think it used to be about business certainty, about how much projects would cost. It would be about economic growth and local jobs and investment. But more and more, it's about decarbonization. And decarbonization in particular is on a timetable. And I think that has created a lot of space for bipartisan progress on this issue. At the same time, Jim, you mentioned this earlier, the concept of environmental justice. I think some in the environmental justice community hear the words permitting reform and they start off with a degree of skepticism. And, for good reason. There are lots of examples of past projects that actually caused harm to local communities. So my question for you is environmental justice and the concept of a more efficient permitting system, are those concepts incompatible?
I'll jump in. First of all, I think that environmental justice is just as foundational of an imperative as the decarbonization work itself, number one. Number two, I think communities have every right to be skeptical because these processes also haven't worked for them. Yeah, they've been long, they've been laborious, they've been expensive. And you have to expert up to be able meaningfully to participate. So the opportunity is here to drive new thinking and process that decarbonizes and delivers genuine seat at the table. One of the things that we emphasized is for us, equity here should involve real equity, real ownership. And where I think we now also have some very compelling examples of how this has been very meaningfully thought through and delivered, unlike the processes we have had to date. And what I point to is the work of Block Power, Donnell Baird and team. They are bringing the community to the table on the front end And not just to check the box that there's been some community engagement, but the community gets an ownership stake and gets to vote and gets to shape and gets to draw lines on the map. And so for me, equity, you bet, equity, where's my check? How do I participate? How do I actually get to make some of the decisions and not just have somebody else say that they checked the box and they fulfilled that part of the process and it not deliver a different, we can deliver a different result as we deliver deep decarbonization. And both of these things now move in tandem because the status quo isn't protecting the environment or giving voice for equity and justice.
Thank you so much. That's a terrific answer. Unfortunately, we are out of time for this panel, though I think we could probably talk for another hour and have plenty to say. I'm optimistic about this. You know, we've got Democrats and Republicans here on the panel agreeing. We've got Democrats and Republicans in Congress pushing forward and making the permitting system more efficient. So I'm looking forward to seeing what Congress has in stake for us this fall. And I'm wishing everybody a happy rest of your Clean Energy Week. Thanks, Katie. Thanks, Jim.
Thank you.